Upon hearing the cleaner play the piano, the millionaire froze upon recognizing the music. The same one she taught her daughter before she disappeared 20 years ago. The grand mansion on the outskirts of Boston sat cloaked in silence, its vast halls echoing a hollow solitude. Margaret Collins, a woman of elegance and undeniable presence, carried an air of authority matched only by the sadness etched into her sharp features. At 52, her success in business was unparalleled, but her life felt like a hollow monument to everything she had lost. 20 years had passed since Emily, her only daughter, had vanished without a trace. Not a day went by that Margaret didn't think of her. Yet, she had long since stopped allowing herself the luxury of tears or memories. Instead, she buried herself in work, turning her family's modest fortune into an empire. The mansion, with its cold marble floors and towering ceilings, reflected her inner state. Grand but empty, one crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret sat in her office, reviewing contracts with mechanical precision, her pen scratched against paper, the silence only broken by the faint rustle of pages. Suddenly, a soft melody floated through the air, carried like a whisper from the past. She froze, her hand tightening around the pen as the notes reached her ears. It was unmistakable. The delicate tune was the very one she had composed with Emily when her daughter was just a child. A hauntingly beautiful piece that only the two of them knew. Her breath hitched as she rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, as if afraid the sound might vanish if she acted too quickly. She followed the melody down the long corridor, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and desperate hope. The notes grew louder as she approached the grand piano in the living room. There, seated on the polished bench, was Lila, the new housekeeper Margaret had hired just weeks ago. The young woman's fingers danced over the keys with an ease that spoke of years of practice. Her head was bowed slightly, a look of quiet concentration on her face as she played. Margaret felt a jolt, her knees nearly buckling. How could Lila possibly know that song? It was as if a ghost from her past had materialized in the flesh. Lila's playing faltered when she sensed Margaret's presence. She looked up, startled, her wide brown eyes locking with Margaret's. "Oh, Mrs. Collins, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I didn't mean to intrude. The piano caught my eye, and I couldn't resist." Margaret took a step closer, her voice trembling. "Where did you learn that song?" Lila blinked, confused. "This song? I don't really know. It's just something I've always known. I guess my mother used to hum it when I was little. Before she paused, her voice breaking slightly. Before she passed away." Margaret's heart clenched at the words. A strange mix of emotions surged within her. Disbelief, longing, and a growing sense of unease. "Your mother taught you this song?" she asked, her tone sharper than intended. Lila nodded hesitantly. "Yes, though I don't remember much about her. I was very young when she died. It's the only thing I have left of her. A melody she used to sing to me." Margaret's mind raced. It couldn't be a coincidence. She had never shared the song with anyone outside her family, and yet here was Lila, playing it flawlessly. "Lila," Margaret said, forcing herself to remain calm. "Where did you grow up?" "In an orphanage, just outside Boston," Lila replied softly. "I don't know much about my parents. They left me there when I was 3, or at least, that's what I've been told." Margaret felt the room spin, as fragments of the past collided with the present. The possibility that this young woman could somehow be connected to Emily was almost too much to comprehend. She struggled to maintain her composure, offering Lila a tight smile. "Thank you for sharing that with me. It's a beautiful song." Lila, sensing the tension in Margaret's demeanor, quickly apologized again and excused herself, leaving the room in an awkward hurry. Margaret remained by the piano, her hand brushing over the keys as the last notes of the melody seemed to linger in the air. The questions in her mind swirled like a storm. Could Lila truly be connected to her daughter? Or was this just a cruel trick of fate? Determined not to let the matter rest, Margaret made a decision. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Picking up her phone, she dialed the number of an old acquaintance, a private investigator who had helped her in the past. "Samuel Blake," a familiar voice answered after the first ring. "Samuel, it's Margaret Collins," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I need your help. I've stumbled upon something unusual and I need you to look into it." As Margaret hung up the phone, she gazed out the window, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. For the first time in years, a spark of hope flickered in her chest. Though it was tinged with fear, she had no idea what she would uncover, but she was determined to follow the melody to its end. The next morning, the mansion awoke to its usual quiet hum of activity. The household staff moved through their routines with practiced efficiency, polishing surfaces, arranging flowers, and ensuring every corner reflected the grandeur Margaret demanded. But Margaret's focus wasn't on the day's agenda or the paperwork waiting in her office. Her thoughts were consumed by Lila and the inexplicable connection she might have to Emily. Margaret descended the sweeping staircase and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Lila wiping down the counter. The young woman looked up, startled, as Margaret entered. Her nervousness was evident. She was still uneasy after the previous day's encounter at the piano. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," Lila said softly, straightening her posture. "Can I get you some coffee?" Margaret offered a small nod. "Yes, thank you, but I'd like to talk to you for a moment, if you don't mind." Lila paused mid-step, her face reflecting both curiosity and apprehension. "Of course," she replied, her voice cautious. She poured a cup of coffee and set it gently on the marble island before sitting down across from Margaret. Margaret studied Lila for a moment, taking in her delicate features and the way her hands fidgeted nervously. There was something so familiar about her, though she couldn't quite place it. "You mentioned yesterday that your mother used to hum that song. Do you remember anything else about her?" Margaret asked, her tone carefully measured. Lila shook her head slowly. "Not much," she admitted. "I was only 3 when she passed. The orphanage staff told me she left me there because she couldn't take care of me anymore. They said she was struggling." Margaret's heart ached at the thought of a child so young being abandoned. "Did she leave anything behind? A photograph? A letter? Anything at all?" Lila hesitated before nodding. "There was a necklace," she said. "It has a small pendant. Just a simple gold heart. I don't know if it was hers or something she bought for me. But I've kept it all these years." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. A gold heart pendant. Emily had a necklace just like that. A gift Margaret had given her for her 8th birthday. "Do you have it with you?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of urgency. "Yes," Lila said, rising from her seat. "It's in my room, I'll get it." As Lila disappeared up the staircase, Margaret felt her hands trembling. Could this really be happening? Could Lila somehow be Emily? Or at least connected to her in a way Margaret hadn't yet pieced together? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. When Lila returned, she was holding a delicate gold chain with a heart-shaped pendant dangling from it. She handed it to Margaret, who took it with a reverence that surprised even herself. The pendant was worn, its surface scratched from years of wear, but it was unmistakably familiar. "This belonged to my daughter," Margaret whispered, her voice breaking. She looked up at Lila, tears brimming in her eyes. "I gave her one just like this." Lila's eyes widened in shock. "Your daughter," she echoed. "But how is that possible?" Margaret shook her head, unable to form a coherent answer. "I don't know," she admitted. "But there's something about you, Lila. Something that feels connected." Lila seemed overwhelmed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. "Mrs. Collins, are you saying I could be—" "I don't know," Margaret interrupted gently. "Not yet, but I intend to find out." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. Margaret reached across the counter and placed a reassuring hand over Lila's. "If there's even a chance that you're connected to Emily, we need to uncover the truth. Are you willing to let me help you?" Lila nodded slowly, though her expression was one of uncertainty. "I don't have much to lose," she said quietly. "And if this could give me answers about my mother, I want to know." Margaret felt a wave of determination rise within her. She had spent 2 decades living with the pain of Emily's disappearance, and now, for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. "I've already contacted a private investigator," she told Lila. "His name is Samuel Blake, and he's one of the best. He'll help us figure this out." Lila managed a faint smile, though the anxiety in her eyes was clear. "Thank you, Mrs. Collins. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Margaret replied firmly. "Just trust me. We'll get to the bottom of this." As the conversation ended, Margaret felt a mix of emotions coursing through her: hope, fear, and a renewed sense of purpose. She watched as Lila returned to her work, her movements careful and deliberate. There was a vulnerability to the young woman that tugged at Margaret's heartstrings, a reminder of the daughter she had lost. Later that day, Margaret met with Samuel Blake at her office in the mansion. She laid out everything she knew, from the song Lila had played to the gold pendant she carried. Samuel listened intently, his expression serious as he took notes. "This is definitely unusual," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But I've seen stranger things. I'll start by looking into Lila's background, where she was born, her time at the orphanage, anything that might give us a lead." Margaret nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do whatever it takes," she said. "I need to know the truth." As Samuel left, Margaret sat alone in the office, the pendant still clutched in her hand. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the melody that had haunted her for so long would finally lead her back to her daughter. The days following Margaret's conversation with Lila unfolded like a dream she wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. The melody, the pendant, and the uncanny resemblance between Lila's story and the timeline of Emily's disappearance all created a puzzle Margaret was desperate to solve. For years, she had buried her emotions under layers of work and self-discipline, but now those walls were crumbling, brick by brick. Samuel Blake, the investigator Margaret had hired, worked quietly but efficiently. His reputation as a meticulous professional was well earned, and Margaret trusted him to unearth the answers she so desperately needed. Early one morning, Samuel called Margaret to update her on his progress. "I've started digging into Lila's background," he said, his voice steady and businesslike. "The orphanage she mentioned, St. Mark's right outside Boston, has records that match her story. She was left there at around 3 years old with no identifying documents, other than a small note tucked into her belongings." "A note?" Margaret asked, her breath catching. "What did it say?" "I haven't seen it yet," Samuel replied. "I'm meeting with the administrator later today. If it's still on file, it might give us a lead." Margaret nodded, even though Samuel couldn't see her over the phone. "Thank you," she said softly. "Please keep me updated." Hanging up, Margaret felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. Every new detail brought her closer to the truth, but it also raised the stakes. If Lila truly was Emily, or even connected to her, then the past 20 years of pain and longing could finally have meaning. But what if it wasn't true? What if she was setting herself up for yet another heartbreak? Later that afternoon, Margaret wandered through the house, her thoughts too scattered to focus on work. She found herself in the living room, standing in front of the grand piano where Lila had played the haunting melody just days before. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Hesitant, she hadn't touched the piano since Emily's disappearance. It had felt too painful, like reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. But now, with everything happening, Margaret felt an inexplicable pull. Slowly, she sat down on the bench and let her hands rest on the cool ivory keys. The first note she played was hesitant, almost trembling, but as she continued, the melody flowed, each note resonating through the room like a whisper from the past. She closed her eyes, letting the music envelop her, until she felt a presence behind her. Turning, she saw Lila standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of awe and sadness. "You play beautifully," Lila said quietly, stepping into the room. Margaret smiled faintly, motioning for Lila to join her. "It's been a long time," she admitted. "The last time I played this song was with my daughter." Lila hesitated, then sat beside Margaret on the bench. "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me," she said. "About your daughter and about me." Margaret studied the young woman's face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "It's a lot to process," she said gently. "I know this is probably overwhelming for you." "It is," Lila admitted. "But I've always felt like there was a part of me missing. You know, like I've been searching for something my whole life but didn't know what it was." Margaret nodded, her heart aching at Lila's words. "I've felt the same way since the day Emily disappeared." Their conversation was interrupted by the ringing of Margaret's phone. Excusing herself, she stepped into the hallway to answer. "Margaret," Samuel's voice came through, firm and clear. "I've got the note." Margaret's heart raced. "What does it say?" "It's short," Samuel said. "Just one line. Please take care of her." She's not safe with me. And it's signed with the initials EC. Margaret's breath caught. EC, she whispered. Emily Collins. It's possible, Samuel said cautiously. But I'll need to confirm the handwriting. Do you have any samples from your daughter? Yes, Margaret said quickly. I'll find something and send it to you. After ending the call, Margaret leaned against the wall, her mind spinning. The note was the strongest lead they had, but it also raised more questions. Why would Emily, or someone claiming to be her, abandon a child at an orphanage? And what danger had she been trying to escape? That evening, Samuel visited the mansion to collect the handwriting samples Margaret had gathered from Emily's old journals and school notebooks. As they reviewed the items together, Margaret couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia, seeing Emily's neat, looping handwriting brought back a flood of memories, helping her with homework, reading bedtime stories, and watching her scribble lyrics for the songs they'd composed together. This should be enough to compare, Samuel said, slipping the samples into a folder. I'll have an expert analyze the note against these. It might take a day or two, but we'll get an answer. Thank you, Margaret said sincerely. I don't know what I'd do without your help. Samuel offered a reassuring smile. You're closer to the truth than you've been in 20 years. We'll get there. After Samuel left, Margaret sat alone in her office, the house eerily quiet around her. She clutched one of Emily's journals in her hands, flipping through its pages and letting the familiar handwriting calm her racing thoughts. The weight of the past 2 decades pressed heavily on her, but for the first time, she felt like she was taking steps toward closure, or perhaps a new beginning. The only question now was whether the answer she sought would bring healing, or more heartbreak. Samuel Blake's reputation as a diligent investigator proved itself as the days unfolded. Margaret waited anxiously, her thoughts bouncing between hope and fear. She spent her days pacing the halls of her mansion, memories of Emily and questions about Lila swirling through her mind. The pendant, now safely tucked in a drawer, seemed to radiate an invisible pull, demanding answers. One evening, Margaret sat in her study, surrounded by Emily's old photos and belongings. She hadn't touched these keepsakes in years, but now, they felt like pieces of a puzzle she needed to solve. As she traced her fingers over a photograph of Emily at 8 years old, the phone on her desk buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was Samuel. I have something, Samuel said without preamble, his tone both cautious and intrigued. Margaret straightened in her chair, gripping the phone tightly. What did you find? I've spoken with the administrator of St. Mark's Orphanage, Samuel began. They confirmed that Lila was left there as a toddler, around 3 years old. She came with nothing but that note we discussed, and a small bag of belongings. Margaret's heart pounded. And the handwriting on the note, did they match it? That's the interesting part, Samuel replied. The expert believes it's highly likely that the handwriting matches your daughter's samples. It's not definitive yet, but it's a strong lead. The words hit Margaret like a tidal wave. Her breath caught, and she had to steady herself against the edge of the desk. So it's possible, she whispered, more to herself than to Samuel. It's really possible. It is, Samuel confirmed, his tone cautious. But there's something else. The orphanage records show that a woman visited Lila shortly after she was left there. She used the name Emily Collins. Margaret froze. Visited her? What do you mean? She came twice, according to their visitor logs, Samuel explained. The first time, she left abruptly, almost as if she were spooked. The second time, she spoke briefly with the staff, but left without seeing the child. Margaret's thoughts raced. Emily had been alive after her disappearance. She had left Lila at the orphanage but stayed close enough to visit. Why? What had driven her to abandon her daughter? Do they have any more information on this Emily Collins? Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Unfortunately, no, there's no photo. And the staff who were there at the time have all moved on or passed away. But it's worth noting that the name might not even be real. It could have been an alias. Margaret nodded, though her mind felt like it was spinning in 1,000 directions. What about Lila's birth records? Did they find anything there? Samuel sighed. That's where things get tricky. There are no official birth records for Lila. It's as if she appeared out of nowhere. If Emily, or whoever this woman was, used false information to admit her to the orphanage, it would explain the gaps. Margaret exhaled slowly, processing the implications. "I need to see that logbook," she said firmly. "I need to see her name written there." "I'll arrange it," Samuel replied. "In the meantime, I'm going to keep digging. There's more to this story. I'm sure of it." Later that evening, Margaret sat at the dining table, her appetite non-existent. Lila entered the room, carrying a tray of tea, and hesitated when she saw Margaret's somber expression. "Mrs. Collins," Lila said softly, setting the tray down. "Is everything all right?" Margaret looked up at her, studying the young woman's face. There was a fragility in Lila, but also a quiet strength that reminded Margaret of Emily. She decided to share part of what Samuel had uncovered. "I spoke with the investigator today," Margaret began, her voice measured. "He found records from the orphanage. They suggest that someone claiming to be my daughter visited you there when you were a child." Lila's eyes widened, her hands trembling as she poured the tea. "Someone visited me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded. "Yes, twice. Apparently it might have been Emily, or someone pretending to be her. We don't know yet." Lila sat down slowly, her expression a mixture of shock and confusion. "I don't remember anyone," she admitted. "I mean, I was so young, but I always thought no one wanted me." Margaret's heart ached at Lila's words. "If it was Emily, then she did want you," she said gently. "But something must have stopped her, something bigger than either of us." Lila looked down at her hands, her emotions written plainly across her face. "I've spent my whole life wondering who I was," she said softly. "And now it feels like I'm finally getting close. But it's terrifying." Margaret reached across the table and placed a comforting hand over Lila's. "I know it's a lot to take in," she said, "but you're not alone in this. We'll face whatever comes next together." The following day, Margaret accompanied Samuel to St. Mark's Orphanage. The old brick building was worn but well kept, its walls holding decades of stories within them. Margaret's heart raced as they entered the administrator's office, where a thick logbook rested on the desk. The administrator, a kind-looking woman in her 60s, flipped the pages carefully until she found the entries from 2 decades ago. She pointed to the name, Emily Collins. Margaret stared at the handwritten words, her chest tightening. It was there, clear as day, a ghost from the past reaching out to the present. "She signed this herself," the administrator said, "but I'm afraid that's all we have. There's no photo, no contact information." Margaret's fingers brushed over the faded ink as a single tear rolled down her cheek. "It's her," she whispered. "I know it's her." Samuel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "This is a big step forward," he said, "but it's only the beginning. We'll find out what happened. Every detail." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. She wasn't just chasing ghosts anymore. She was following a trail that would lead her to the truth. Margaret spent the next few days poring over every piece of evidence Samuel had collected. The name Emily Collins in the orphanage logbook felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread connecting Margaret's present to a past she had spent 2 decades mourning. The thought of Emily visiting Lila, even fleetingly, reignited Margaret's determination. She wasn't just seeking closure anymore. She was determined to uncover the truth behind her daughter's disappearance. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when the sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Margaret was in her study, reviewing a file Samuel had dropped off earlier that morning. The housekeeper answered the door, and after a brief conversation, she entered the study to announce the unexpected visitor. "Mrs. Collins, your sister, Eleanor, is here," the housekeeper said hesitantly. Margaret's hand froze mid-turn of a page. Eleanor, they hadn't spoken in years, and the last time they did, it hadn't ended well. Margaret rose slowly, smoothing her blouse as she prepared herself for whatever reason Eleanor had to show up uninvited. When Margaret entered the sitting room, Eleanor was already seated, her umbrella propped against the edge of the sofa. She looked immaculate, as always, with her tailored coat and pristine makeup. But her sharp eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "Eleanor," Margaret greeted coolly, keeping her voice measured. "This is unexpected." Eleanor offered a tight smile, her polished demeanor unshaken. "I was in the neighborhood," she said lightly, though Margaret knew better than to believe such an excuse. Eleanor never did anything without a reason. Margaret sat across from her, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" she asked, her tone as neutral as she could manage. Eleanor hesitated, a rare crack in her otherwise perfect facade. "I heard you've been digging into Emily's disappearance," she said finally, her voice softer than Margaret expected. Margaret stiffened. "And how exactly did you hear that?" Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "Word travels, especially when you hire someone as well known as Samuel Blake." She leaned forward slightly, her tone sharpening. "Margaret, why are you stirring up old ghosts? It's been 20 years. Let it go." Margaret's jaw tightened, her temper simmering just beneath the surface. "Let it go," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Eleanor, this isn't just about the past. I've found something, someone, that might be connected to Emily." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Connected how?" Margaret hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "There's a young woman working here, Lila. She knows a song that only Emily and I shared. And there's more. Samuel found records suggesting Emily may have visited her at the orphanage where she grew up. For the first time," Eleanor's composed expression faltered. A flicker of something, panic perhaps, crossed her face before she quickly masked it. "Margaret," she said carefully, "don't get your hopes up. You've been chasing shadows for years. What makes this time any different?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice firm. "Because this time, I have evidence. And if there's even the slightest chance that Lila is connected to Emily, I won't stop until I know the truth." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. Finally, she sighed, leaning back against the sofa. "Just be careful." "Margaret," she said, her tone almost wary. "Sometimes, digging into the past can bring up things better left buried." Margaret studied her sister, suspicion prickling at the back of her mind. There was something about Eleanor's reaction that didn't sit right with her. It wasn't concern. It was something darker, something hidden. Eleanor rose gracefully, smoothing her coat. "I won't keep you any longer," she said, her voice once again the picture of politeness. "But do think about what I said." Margaret stood as well, forcing a tight smile. "I'll keep it in mind," she said evenly, though she had no intention of doing so. As Eleanor left, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her sister knew more than she was letting on. The way she had reacted to the mention of Lila and the orphanage, it wasn't just skepticism, it was fear. That evening, Margaret sat in her office, replaying the conversation with Eleanor in her mind. Every word, every expression, seemed laden with hidden meaning. She picked up her phone and called Samuel. "Samuel," she said when he answered, "I need you to look into someone else. My sister, Eleanor." "Your sister?" Samuel asked, surprised. "Why?" "Because she showed up today unannounced and she was off," Margaret explained. "She knew I was investigating Emily's disappearance, and she tried to convince me to drop it. It felt like she was hiding something." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Before Samuel responded, "All right," he said. "I'll see what I can find. Do you think she could have been involved in Emily's disappearance?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted, her voice heavy. "But I wouldn't put anything past her. She always had a way of manipulating things to her advantage." "All right," Samuel said again. "I'll dig into her background and see if anything comes up." As she hung up, Margaret felt a new determination settle over her. If Eleanor was hiding something, Margaret would find out what it was. She had spent 20 years living in the shadow of loss, and now she was closer to the truth than ever. She wouldn't let anyone, especially not Eleanor, stand in her way. Margaret turned back to her desk, her eyes falling on the pendant she had taken from Lila. She picked it up, the cool metal pressing against her palm. Whatever secrets the past held, she was ready to face them, no matter how painful they might be. The days following Eleanor's unexpected visit were fraught with tension. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her sister's cryptic warnings were more than just concern. Eleanor had always been a master of veiled words and subtle manipulation, and her behavior during their conversation only deepened Margaret's suspicions. Samuel Blake, true to his reputation, wasted no time investigating Eleanor. Margaret knew her sister had always been ambitious and competitive, but the idea that Eleanor might be hiding something about Emily's disappearance was a thought she hadn't allowed herself to entertain. Until now, one rainy evening, Samuel called Margaret with an update. "I've found something," he began, his tone cautious but resolute. "It's not definitive, but it's enough to raise eyebrows." Margaret leaned forward in her chair, her grip tightening on the phone. "What is it?" "Financial records," Samuel explained. "Your sister's accounts show several unusual transactions around the time Emily disappeared. Large sums of money being withdrawn in cash and then nothing. No clear explanation for where it went or why." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "How much are we talking about?" "Enough to suggest she wasn't just covering everyday expenses," Samuel replied. "It's suspicious, especially considering the timing, and there's more. I found records indicating that Eleanor visited a property in upstate New York a few weeks after Emily went missing. It's owned by someone with no apparent connection to her or your family." Margaret's thoughts raced. "Do you think she could have been involved in Emily's disappearance?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't want to jump to conclusions," Samuel said carefully, "but there's enough here to warrant further investigation." "I'll keep digging." Margaret thanked him and hung up, her mind spinning. The idea that Eleanor could have played a role in Emily's disappearance was almost too much to bear. But if it was true, Margaret needed to know. The next morning, Margaret found herself in the kitchen with Lila, who was preparing breakfast. The young woman had become more comfortable in the mansion, though there was still a lingering awkwardness between them. Margaret watched as Lila moved around the kitchen, her movements fluid but deliberate. "Lila," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something?" Lila turned, her expression curious but open. "Of course, Mrs. Collins." Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "When you were at the orphanage, did anyone ever mention visitors? People who might have come to see you, even if you didn't meet them yourself?" Lila frowned, her brow furrowing in thought. "Not really," she said slowly. "But there was this one time, I must have been about 6 or 7, when one of the staff mentioned that someone had been asking about me. I didn't think much of it at the time." Margaret's pulse quickened. "Did they say who it was?" "No," Lila admitted. "Just that it was a woman. I assumed it was probably someone from social services." Margaret nodded, though her mind was already racing. Could it have been Eleanor? If her sister had been involved in Emily's disappearance, it wasn't impossible that she had also kept tabs on Lila. That afternoon, Samuel called again. This time, his voice carried a sense of urgency. "I've uncovered something else," he said. "That property in upstate New York. It was listed under a shell company connected to Eleanor. And get this, the property was sold shortly after Emily's disappearance, with no record of what it was used for." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means Eleanor was hiding something," Samuel said bluntly. "I'm heading up there now to see what I can find. If there's anything left to uncover, I'll let you know." Margaret spent the rest of the day in a state of restless anticipation. She couldn't focus on work, couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a revelation that could either bring her closure or shatter her world entirely. That evening, as the rain continued to fall outside, Margaret received another call from Samuel. "I found something," he said, his voice grim. "There's not much left of the property. It's been abandoned for years, but I did find some documents hidden in what looks like an old safe. Letters, mostly." Margaret's breath caught. "Letters?" "Yes," Samuel confirmed. "One of them was written by Emily. It's dated a few weeks after her disappearance, she mentions, being afraid, and she refers to someone who was supposed to help her but betrayed her instead." Margaret's heart pounded. "Did she name the person?" "No," Samuel said regretfully. "She only uses initials E, but it's enough to suggest she was coerced into something. I'll bring the documents back to Boston so you can see them yourself." Margaret hung up the phone, her mind reeling. The evidence was mounting, and all signs seemed to point to Eleanor. But why? What could possibly have driven her sister to betray Emily? And what role had she played in the years since? The next day, Samuel arrived at the mansion with the documents in hand. Margaret pored over the letters, her hands shaking as she read Emily's words. The fear and betrayal in her daughter's voice were palpable, even through the faded ink. "She was trying to protect someone," Margaret murmured, her eyes scanning the page. "She said she couldn't come home because it would put them in danger." "Someone close to her," Samuel agreed. "Possibly Lila." Margaret's gaze snapped to Samuel. "You think she was protecting Lila?" "It's possible," Samuel said. "Emily might have left her at the orphanage to keep her safe. And if Eleanor was involved, she may have been the threat Emily was trying to shield her from." Margaret's mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they painted was far darker than she had anticipated. If Eleanor had truly been the one to orchestrate Emily's disappearance, then Margaret was not only fighting for the truth but also for justice, and she would not stop until both were served. The storm outside mirrored Margaret's emotions as she sat at her desk. Emily's letters spread out before her like fragile pieces of a shattered past. Each word seemed to echo with the fear and desperation Emily must have felt, and Margaret's heart ached with the knowledge that her daughter had suffered alone. But there was also anger at Eleanor, whose name now loomed large in every revelation, and anger at herself for not seeing the signs sooner. Samuel had left the mansion a few hours earlier to follow up on the information from the letters. Leaving Margaret to wrestle with the questions they raised, she couldn't ignore the possibility that Emily had sacrificed everything to protect Lila. And if Eleanor was the threat Emily had feared, then Margaret needed to act before any more damage could be done. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Mrs. Collins?" Lila's voice called hesitantly. "Come in," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Lila entered, her expression tentative. "I brought you some tea," she said, setting the tray down on the desk. "You've been working all day. I thought you might need a break." Margaret offered a faint smile, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Lila. That's very kind of you." Lila hesitated, her eyes falling on the letters spread across the desk. "Are those about your daughter?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. "Yes. They were written by Emily shortly after she disappeared. They confirm that she was trying to protect someone." Lila's brow furrowed. "Do you think it was me?" Margaret studied her, torn between wanting to shield Lila from the weight of the truth and the growing realization that Lila had a right to know. Finally, she said, "I think it's possible. Emily left you at the orphanage, and then she vanished. Everything points to her doing it to keep you safe." Lila sank into the chair opposite Margaret, her hands trembling. "I don't even know what to say," she whispered. "All this time, I thought I was just abandoned, but she was protecting me." Margaret reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand over Lila's. "If what we're uncovering is true, then Emily made the hardest choice a mother can make. She loved you enough to let you go." Lila's eyes brimmed with tears, and for a moment, the two women sat in silence, connected by the shared pain of a past neither could fully understand. Finally, Lila wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "What do we do now?" she asked. Margaret's gaze hardened with determination. "We find out the rest of the truth, and we hold Eleanor accountable for whatever part she played in this." The following day, Samuel called with another update. His voice was sharp, cutting through the early morning quiet. "Margaret, I've got something concrete," he said. "I found a witness who worked at the property Eleanor owned in New York. He's an older man now, but he remembers seeing a young woman, Emily, there in the weeks after her disappearance." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "What did he say?" "He remembers her being upset, arguing with Eleanor," Samuel explained. "He said Emily wanted to leave, but Eleanor wouldn't let her. According to him, it sounded like Eleanor was threatening her with something. Possibly Lila." Margaret's stomach churned. "So Eleanor used Lila as leverage to control Emily." "It looks that way," Samuel confirmed. The witness also mentioned seeing Eleanor leave the property abruptly one night. Emily was gone the next day, and the place was abandoned not long after. Margaret's mind raced. "Does he have any idea where Emily might have gone?" "Unfortunately, no," Samuel said. "But this corroborates what we suspected. Eleanor was directly involved in Emily's disappearance." Margaret's hands trembled as she hung up the phone. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they painted was darker than she had imagined. Eleanor had not only manipulated Emily, but had likely been the reason her daughter had spent her final days in fear. Margaret decided it was time to confront her sister. She called Eleanor, her voice carefully neutral as she invited her over under the pretense of wanting to clear the air. Eleanor, always eager to maintain appearances, agreed without hesitation. When Eleanor arrived, she was all smiles, her polished demeanor as impeccable as ever. But Margaret saw through it now, the carefully constructed mask of someone who had spent years hiding the truth. "Thank you for coming," Margaret said as she led Eleanor into the sitting room. "We need to talk." Eleanor sat gracefully, crossing her legs and folding her hands in her lap. "Of course, Margaret. What's on your mind?" Margaret wasted no time. "It's about Emily." Eleanor's smile faltered, and for a brief moment, Margaret saw a flicker of unease. "Margaret, we've been over this. It's been 20 years. I know what you did," Margaret interrupted, her voice sharp. "I know you were involved in her disappearance." Eleanor stiffened, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Stop lying," Margaret snapped, standing and towering over her sister. "We have witnesses. Letters, financial records, everything points to you. You used her, manipulated her, and drove her to leave. Why? Eleanor, why would you do that?" Eleanor's calm facade cracked, anger flashing in her eyes. "You always had everything," she spat. "The business, the money, the family. Emily adored you. And I was nothing more than the forgotten sister. Do you know what it's like to live in someone's shadow?" Margaret stared at her, horrified. "So you destroyed my family because of jealousy. It wasn't supposed to go that far," Eleanor said, her voice shaking now. "I just wanted her to leave for a while, to give you a taste of what it was like to lose, but she wouldn't listen. And then, everything spiraled out of control." Margaret felt her legs weaken, but she forced herself to stay standing. "You had no right," she said, her voice breaking. "Emily is gone because of you. And Lila, she grew up without her mother because of you." Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the door, as if weighing her chances of escape. "Margaret, listen." "No," Margaret said firmly. "I'm done listening. You're going to tell me everything. And then, you're going to face the consequences of what you've done." Eleanor's silence spoke volumes, and Margaret knew the time for evasion was over. The truth, at long last, was coming to light. Margaret's confrontation with Eleanor left the air in the mansion heavy with tension. Eleanor's confession echoed in Margaret's mind long after her sister stormed out, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floors. There was no denying it now. Eleanor had been the catalyst for Emily's disappearance. The pieces were coming together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Chief among them was how Eleanor's actions had ultimately led to Lila, growing up alone in an orphanage. As Margaret sat in her study, staring blankly at the letters Emily had written, Samuel Blake called again. His voice, typically calm and measured, carried a note of urgency. "Margaret, we have a problem," he began without preamble. "Eleanor knows we're onto her. She's trying to cover her tracks." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "She's been making phone calls, trying to access old accounts tied to the property in New York," Samuel explained. "I also found out she's been looking into Lila's background, specifically where she's staying now." Margaret's blood ran cold. "She knows Lila is here." "It's likely," Samuel confirmed grimly. "I don't think she's going to take this lying down, Margaret. Be prepared for anything." Margaret clenched the phone tightly, her mind racing. "Thank you, Samuel. Keep me updated." Hanging up, Margaret immediately called Lila into the study. The young woman appeared moments later, her expression concerned. "Mrs. Collins, is everything okay?" Lila asked, taking a seat across from Margaret. Margaret hesitated, unsure of how much to tell her, but the look of worry on Lila's face convinced her to be honest. "Lila," she began, "there's something you need to know, my sister, Eleanor. She's been involved in Emily's disappearance, and now, it seems she's trying to find out more about you." Lila's eyes widened in alarm. "Why would she do that? What does she want?" Margaret reached across the desk, placing a comforting hand over Lila's. "I don't know yet, but I promise you this. I won't let her hurt you." That evening, Margaret doubled the security around the mansion, hiring guards to patrol the grounds and ensuring that every entry point was locked and monitored. She knew Eleanor well enough to recognize that her sister was capable of desperate and reckless actions when cornered. Despite the precautions, the night passed uneventfully. The next morning, however, Margaret awoke to a knock on her bedroom door. It was one of the guards, his expression serious. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "we found someone on the property early this morning. A woman. She was trying to get in through the garden gate." Margaret's heart raced. "Who was it?" "She wouldn't give us her name," the guard replied. "But she matches the description of your sister," Margaret didn't need any more confirmation. She hurried downstairs, where another guard was keeping Eleanor in the front parlor. Her sister's polished appearance was slightly disheveled, her usual composure replaced with barely concealed anger. "What the hell are you doing here, Eleanor?" Margaret demanded, her voice cold. Eleanor rose from her seat, her expression defiant. "I came to talk to you," she said, "but your goons wouldn't even let me in the front door. You were sneaking in through the garden." Margaret shot back. "That's not exactly the behavior of someone who wants to talk." Eleanor crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Fine, I was trying to see Lila." Margaret stiffened, her protective instincts flaring. "Why? What do you want with her?" Eleanor's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You mean you haven't figured it out yet? That girl is my leverage, Margaret. She's the one thing Emily cared about enough to leave you for." Margaret's voice rose, her anger boiling over. "Leverage for what? Emily is gone, Eleanor, and now you want to drag Lila into your mess. Haven't you done enough damage?" Eleanor's expression hardened. "I didn't come here to argue. I came to warn you. You're digging into things that should have been left buried. If you keep pushing, you'll regret it." Margaret's fists clenched at her sides. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice trembling with fury. "And stay away from Lila. If you come near her again, I'll make sure you pay for everything you've done." Eleanor hesitated, her eyes searching Margaret's face for any sign of weakness. Finding none, she scoffed and turned on her heel. "You always did think you were better than everyone else," she said over her shoulder. "Let's see how far that gets you." As the door slammed shut behind her, Margaret sank into a chair, her chest heaving with the effort to contain her emotions. She had underestimated Eleanor's determination, and now it was clear that her sister wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. Later that evening, Margaret and Lila sat together in the living room, the tension in the air palpable. Margaret had debated whether to tell Lila about Eleanor's intrusion, but ultimately decided that the young woman deserved to know the truth. "Lila," Margaret began gently. "Eleanor was here today." Lila's eyes widened. "Here. What did she want?" "She said she wanted to see you," Margaret admitted. "But I don't trust her motives. She's trying to use you, just like she used Emily." Lila's hands clenched in her lap, her expression a mixture of fear and determination. "What should we do?" Margaret reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Lila's shoulder. "We protect ourselves. I've already taken steps to secure the house, but I need you to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, and let me know if anything feels off." Lila nodded, her resolve clear. "I won't let her scare me. If Emily did everything she could to protect me, then the least I can do is fight for the truth." Margaret felt a swell of pride at Lila's bravery. Despite the danger, the young woman was willing to face the storm head-on. Together, they would stand against Eleanor, determined to uncover the full extent of her betrayal and ensure that justice was served. The next few days were tense, the mansion alive with an undercurrent of unease. Margaret's warning to Eleanor might have temporarily kept her sister at bay, but it was clear that Eleanor wasn't one to back down easily. Margaret and Lila remained vigilant, their every step shadowed by the uncertainty of what Eleanor might do next. Samuel Blake, ever diligent, continued his investigation. His updates painted a clearer picture of Eleanor's web of deceit. But one critical question remained unanswered. Where had Emily gone after her escape from Eleanor's clutches? The letters hinted at fear and secrecy, but the trail was growing colder with every passing day. One evening, Samuel called with news that sent a fresh jolt of energy through Margaret's weary mind. "Margaret, I found something," he said. "It's about the property Eleanor sold after Emily disappeared." Margaret gripped the phone tightly. "What is it?" "The property wasn't sold outright," Samuel explained. "It was transferred to a private buyer under a pseudonym. I traced the transaction to a bank account connected to a woman who matches Emily's description. It seems Emily was trying to hide, but she left a paper trail." Margaret's breath caught. "You think she was alive after she left?" "I do," Samuel replied. "I'm heading to the location now. It's in a remote area outside Albany. If there's anything left, I'll find it." Margaret felt a flicker of hope reignite, even as anxiety gnawed at her. "Let me know as soon as you find anything." "I will," Samuel promised before ending the call. That night, Margaret sat in the living room with Lila, the tension between them unspoken but palpable. Lila had been quieter than usual, her thoughts clearly occupied by the revelations about Eleanor and the growing complexity of her connection to Emily. "Lila," Margaret said gently, breaking the silence. "How are you holding up?" Lila looked up from the cup of tea cradled in her hands. "I'm okay, I guess," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's just a lot. I've spent my whole life wondering who I was, and now it feels like the answers are so close. But also so far away." Margaret nodded, understanding all too well the weight of uncertainty. "We'll find the truth," she assured her. "No matter what it takes." Lila offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." The moment was interrupted by the sound of Margaret's phone buzzing on the table. She picked it up, her heart racing as she saw Samuel's name on the screen. "Samuel," she answered quickly. "I'm at the property," Samuel said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "You're going to want to hear this. The place is abandoned, but there are signs that someone lived here for a while. Old furniture, personal belongings, even some letters. And Margaret, one of them is addressed to you?" Margaret's breath caught. "To me, are you sure?" "Positive," Samuel confirmed. "It's signed Emily. I'm bringing everything back to Boston now. You need to see this." Margaret's grip on the phone tightened. "Drive carefully," she said. "I'll be waiting." As she hung up, Margaret felt a whirlwind of emotions: hope, fear, and the nagging question of what Emily might have written to her all those years ago. The next morning, Samuel arrived at the mansion carrying a worn cardboard box. Margaret and Lila met him in the sitting room, the air heavy with anticipation as he set the box on the coffee table and carefully removed its contents. "This is everything I found," Samuel explained. "Most of it is old and weathered, but the letters were well preserved." Margaret's eyes fell on a stack of envelopes, her heart clenching as she recognized Emily's handwriting on one of them. She reached for it with trembling hands, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Do you want me to step out?" Samuel asked, sensing her hesitation. Margaret shook her head. "No, stay. You've been part of this journey. You should hear it too." Leila sat beside Margaret, her wide eyes fixed on the letter as Margaret carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the yellowed paper inside. Emily's familiar script filled the page, and Margaret's voice shook as she began to read aloud. "Dear Mom," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found me, or at least the pieces of me I couldn't bring myself to share while I was alive." Margaret paused, her chest tightening as the words sank in. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," the letter continued. "I left because I had to. Eleanor threatened me, and she threatened Lila. She said if I didn't stay quiet, she'd make sure neither of us would be safe. I didn't know what else to do, so I ran. I thought if I could keep her away from Lila, then at least she'd have a chance at a better life." Margaret's tears began to fall as she read, her voice breaking. Lila reached for her hand, her own eyes glistening with tears. "I wanted to come back, Mom," the letter read. "Every day, I wanted to call you, to tell you everything, but I was scared. Scared of what Eleanor might do, scared of what you'd think of me for leaving. I hope you can forgive me someday, and I hope you find Lila. She's the best part of me." The letter ended abruptly, leaving Margaret staring at the page as if willing the words to continue. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of her quiet sobs. She wanted to come back," Margaret whispered. "She was trying to protect you, Lila." Lila wiped her tears away, her voice trembling. "She did everything for me, and now it's my turn to protect her memory." Samuel cleared his throat gently. "There's still more to uncover," he said. "Eleanor's actions go deeper than we realized. If Emily left this behind, it's because she wanted you to know the truth." Margaret nodded, a new resolve hardening within her. "Then we'll uncover every last piece," she said firmly. "Eleanor won't get away with this. Not anymore." The room fell silent again, the three of them united by a shared purpose. Emily's words had reignited their determination, and the shadows of the past were slowly giving way to the light of the truth. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of the mansion, casting a warm glow that belied the storm brewing within. Margaret sat in her study, her fingers tracing the edges of Emily's letter as if it could somehow bridge the decades of separation. Lila sat across from her, her expression one of quiet resolve. The truth was unfolding, but it was far from complete, and they both knew the hardest part was yet to come. Samuel Blake had spent the previous evening combing through the rest of the documents found at the abandoned property. Among the letters and fragments of Emily's life, he discovered one piece that could definitively tie Eleanor to Emily's disappearance: a signature on a rental agreement for the New York property, dated just a week before Emily had vanished. But to Margaret, the most pressing matter wasn't just exposing Eleanor. It was proving once and for all that Lila was Emily's daughter. "This is the only way we can be certain," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "A DNA test. If you're willing, Lila, it could confirm what we already feel in our hearts." Lila's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked overwhelmed, but then she nodded, her jaw tightening with determination. "I want to know the truth," she said firmly. "If Emily was my mother, then I need to honor her by knowing who I really am." Margaret's chest swelled with pride at Lila's bravery. "I'll make the arrangements," she said, reaching across the desk to squeeze Lila's hand. "Whatever happens, we're in this together." Later that day, Samuel accompanied Margaret and Lila to a private clinic where the DNA samples were collected. The sterile environment was a stark contrast to the emotional weight of the moment. Margaret tried to remain composed, but the sight of Lila hesitating before swabbing her cheek tugged at her heart. "It's just a formality," Margaret said softly, her voice filled with reassurance. "No matter what the results say, you're already a part of my life." Lila offered a small, grateful smile before handing the sample back to the nurse. The test would take a few days to process, and Margaret knew those days would feel like an eternity. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Samuel stayed late, poring over the timeline of events surrounding Eleanor's involvement in Emily's disappearance. Each new discovery painted a clearer picture of Eleanor's betrayal. "I've cross-referenced the financial records with her travel logs," Samuel explained as he laid out a series of documents on the dining table. "She was funneling money into accounts connected to shell companies around the time Emily disappeared. These companies were tied to properties in New York and Boston." Margaret studied the records, her anger simmering just below the surface. "She was funding Emily's isolation," she said bitterly. "And when Emily finally escaped, Eleanor must have panicked." Samuel nodded. "That's likely why she sold the New York property so quickly. She was trying to erase any connection to Emily." Lila, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "What about after that? If Eleanor thought Emily was gone, why would she care about me now?" Samuel hesitated, his expression grave. "Because you're the loose end. If the truth about your connection to Emily comes out, it exposes everything Eleanor has tried to bury." Margaret's heart clenched. She turned to Lila, her voice firm. "That's why we need to protect you. Eleanor won't stop until she's sure her secrets are safe." As the days passed, the mansion became a fortress of vigilance. Margaret kept a close watch on Lila, who had begun to spend more time at the piano, playing the melody that had first drawn Margaret to her. The music seemed to soothe both of them, a fragile thread of connection to Emily that felt unbreakable. On the third day, the clinic called with the results of the DNA test. Margaret's hands shook as she picked up the phone, her voice trembling as she answered. "This is Dr. Reed," the voice on the other end said. "I have the results of the test you requested." Margaret's breath hitched. "Go on." "There's a 99.9% match," Dr. Reed said. "The samples confirm that Lila is your biological granddaughter." Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks as relief and joy washed over her. "Thank you," she managed to whisper before ending the call. She turned to Lila, who had been standing nearby, her expression filled with nervous anticipation. "It's official," Margaret said, her voice breaking. "You're Emily's daughter. You're my granddaughter." Lila's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she seemed frozen in disbelief. Then, without a word, she rushed into Margaret's arms, clinging to her tightly as they both wept. "I always wanted to know where I came from," Lila whispered through her tears, "but I never imagined it would lead to this." "You're home now," Margaret said, her voice filled with emotion, "and I promise I'll do everything in my power to protect you." That evening, as Margaret and Lila sat together in the living room, the weight of the past few days finally began to lift. Samuel joined them, his demeanor lighter than usual. "This is a major step forward," he said. "With the DNA results, we can prove Lila's connection to Emily. It's not just about Eleanor anymore. It's about giving you both the justice you deserve." Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. "Eleanor has taken so much from us," she said, "but she won't take anything more. It's time to confront her once and for all." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Margaret and Lila exchanged a determined glance. The truth had finally come to light, and together, they would ensure that it couldn't be buried again. The confirmation that Lila was Emily's daughter filled the mansion with a mix of joy and resolve. Margaret had waited 20 long years for this connection, and now that it was here, she felt an unshakable determination to protect her granddaughter and ensure Emily's sacrifices were not in vain. But the truth also brought new urgency. Eleanor's betrayal had robbed Emily of her life and torn apart their family. Margaret knew that confronting her sister was inevitable, and it would need to happen soon. Lila, too, was grappling with the revelations. She spent much of the next day in quiet reflection, wandering the sprawling gardens and letting her thoughts settle. Margaret found her seated on a stone bench near a fountain, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you want some company?" Margaret asked softly. Lila looked up and offered a small smile. "Of course," she said, shifting slightly to make space. Margaret sat beside her, the sound of water trickling from the fountain creating a peaceful backdrop to their conversation. "You've been quiet today," Margaret observed. "What's on your mind?" Lila hesitated, staring at the ripples in the fountain's water. "It's just a lot to process," she admitted. "I spent my whole life feeling like I didn't belong anywhere. And now I have this whole family history I didn't even know about." Margaret reached over, placing a comforting hand on Lila's shoulder. "You belong here," she said firmly. "You always have, and we'll face whatever comes next together." Lila nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I just wish I could have known her," she said softly. "Emily, my mom, I wish I could have had more time with her." Margaret's heart ached at the pain in Lila's voice. "She would have loved you so much," she said, "and she would have been so proud of the woman you've become." For a moment, they sat in silence, the bond between them growing stronger with each passing second. Then Margaret took a deep breath, her tone turning resolute. "We need to talk about Eleanor," she said. "Now that we have proof of your connection to Emily, we can use it to confront her and make sure she answers for what she's done." Lila's expression hardened, her resolve matching Margaret's. "Whatever it takes," she said. "I want justice for my mom." The following day, Samuel Blake arrived at the mansion with the finalized DNA results and the documents linking Eleanor to the New York property. His expression was grim as he laid the evidence out on the dining table. "This is everything we need to confront her," Samuel said. "The DNA results prove Lila's connection to Emily, and the financial records tie Eleanor directly to Emily's disappearance. If she tries to deny it, she won't have a leg to stand on." Margaret nodded, her jaw set. "I'll call her," she said, "but I want to do this face to face." Samuel hesitated. "Are you sure that's wise? Eleanor knows she's cornered. She could try something desperate. That's exactly why it needs to happen in person," Margaret said firmly. "I want to look her in the eye when she's forced to face the truth." Samuel relented, though his expression remained cautious. "All right," he said, "but I'll be there just in case." Margaret picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor's number. The line rang several times before her sister's familiar voice answered. "Margaret," Eleanor said, her tone clipped. "What do you want?" "We need to talk," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. "In person, it's about Emily." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Margaret could almost hear Eleanor weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. "Fine. When and where?" "Come to the mansion," Margaret said. "Tomorrow at noon," Eleanor scoffed. "Always so dramatic." "Fine. I'll be there." As the call ended, Margaret turned to Samuel and Lila, her expression resolute. "Tomorrow, this ends." The next day, Eleanor arrived at the mansion promptly at noon, her presence as imposing as ever. She swept into the sitting room, her heels clicking against the polished floors, and fixed Margaret with a withering glare. "All right, Margaret," she said. "I'm here. What is it this time?" Margaret gestured for her to sit, her demeanor calm but firm. "We need to talk about Emily," she said, "and about what you did to her." Eleanor's expression faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, her lips curling into a cold smile. I don't know what you're talking about, she said smoothly. Emily disappeared 20 years ago. That's ancient history. Not anymore, Margaret said, her voice sharp. She reached for the DNA results and the financial documents Samuel had prepared, sliding them across the table toward Eleanor. These prove everything. Lila is Emily's daughter, and these records tie you to the property where Emily was held after she disappeared. Eleanor's eyes flicked to the papers, her expression darkening. You've been busy, she said, her tone icy. But none of this proves anything. It's all circumstantial. Margaret leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. We have letters, Eleanor. Letters Emily wrote after you forced her to run. She was terrified of you. She knew what you were capable of. Eleanor's mask cracked, her eyes narrowing. You have no idea what you're talking about, she hissed. Emily was weak. She didn't have the spine to handle the real world. I did what I had to do to protect our family. Protect, Margaret shot back, her voice rising. You destroyed our family. You took everything from Emily, and from me. Eleanor rose from her seat, her face twisted with anger. You always thought you were better than me, she spat. But you were blind. Blind to how fragile Emily was. Blind to everything I sacrificed to keep this family together. Margaret stood as well, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. This isn't about me, Eleanor. It's about what you did. And now, the world is going to know the truth. As the room fell silent, Eleanor's defiance began to crumble. For the first time, Margaret saw fear in her sister's eyes, and she knew the battle was nearly won. The tension in the room was palpable as Eleanor glared at Margaret, her once impenetrable armor of confidence showing visible cracks. The papers spread across the table. The DNA test results, the financial records, and Emily's letters felt like a tidal wave of truth crashing down on Eleanor. Yet, she still clung to her defiance, her lips curling into a bitter smile. You think you've won, Eleanor said, her voice low and venomous. You always think you're the righteous one, Margaret, but you have no idea what it's like to live in your shadow. This isn't about shadows or your insecurities, Eleanor, Margaret replied sharply, her voice steady and cutting. This is about Emily, about the pain you caused, the lives you destroyed. Eleanor's laugh was harsh and brittle. Lives I destroyed. You act as if Emily was some saint. She was fragile, Margaret, weak. She couldn't handle the pressure, couldn't handle life. I did what I had to do. Margaret's fists clenched at her sides. You manipulated her, threatened her, and used her child against her. That's not doing what you had to do. That's cruelty. Eleanor's expression shifted, her defiance faltering for a brief moment. You don't understand, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You were always so perfect, so untouchable. Emily adored you, but she depended on me. She needed me to keep her grounded. Needed you. Margaret's voice rose, incredulous. She was terrified of you. Eleanor. She ran because of you. Eleanor's face twisted in anger. She ran because she was scared. Of life. Of failure. Of everything. I was trying to make her stronger. To prepare her for the world. Margaret shook her head, her heart aching with a mix of anger and sorrow. And yet you destroyed her in the process. Leela, who had been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke up, her voice trembling but determined. You didn't protect her. You hurt her. And because of you, I never got to know her. Eleanor turned to Lila, her expression hardening. You don't know what you're talking about, she snapped. You're just a child. I'm not a child, Lila shot back, her voice growing stronger. I'm her daughter, and I've spent my whole life wondering why I didn't have a mother. Now I know it's because of you. Eleanor flinched at Lila's words, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. For a moment, it seemed as if she might break, but then her defensive walls went up again. You don't understand the sacrifices I made, Eleanor said, her voice sharp. Everything I did was for this family, for you, Margaret, for Emily, and now you're turning against me. Turning against you. Margaret's voice cracked with anger. Eleanor, you turned against us the moment you decided your jealousy was more important than your family. You ruined Emily's life. You took her from me, and now you want to stand here and act like a victim. Eleanor's silence was deafening, her face pale as the weight of Margaret's words bore down on her. Samuel, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "Eleanor, it's over," he said. "The evidence is undeniable. The financial records, the letters, the DNA results, they all point back to you. You can try to justify your actions, but the truth is clear. You betrayed your family." Eleanor's eyes darted between Samuel, Margaret, and Lila, her breathing shallow. For the first time, the full gravity of her situation seemed to dawn on her. She was cornered, and there was no way out. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret's gaze was unyielding. "I want the truth. All of it. No more lies. No more excuses. I want to know why you did this and what happened to Emily after she left." Eleanor sank into the chair, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her sins had finally crushed her. "Fine," she said, her voice hollow. "You want the truth? Here it is." Eleanor began to speak, her words spilling out in a mixture of bitterness and regret. She admitted to manipulating Emily, using Lila as leverage to control her, and forcing her to stay at the New York property. But she also revealed something Margaret hadn't expected. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "When Emily finally ran, I thought she'd come back. I thought she'd realize she needed me, but she didn't. She disappeared. And I couldn't find her. I tried to cover my tracks, to hide my involvement, but I didn't know where she went." Margaret's heart sank. "You let her disappear," she said, her voice breaking. "You didn't try to help her. You just let her go." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know what else to do," she admitted. "I was scared. Scared of what you'd think of me. Scared of what would happen if the truth came out." Margaret stared at her sister, a mixture of anger and pity coursing through her. "You were scared," she said, her voice trembling. "Imagine how Emily felt. Imagine how Lila felt, growing up without a mother." Eleanor buried her face in her hands, her sobs echoing in the room. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the full extent of the pain she had caused. As Eleanor's sobs subsided, Margaret stood, her voice firm but no longer angry. "You need to make this right," she said. "You need to face the consequences of what you've done. Not for me. Not for yourself, but for Emily. For Lila." Eleanor looked up at Margaret, her eyes red and swollen. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said softly. I don't know how to fix this." Margaret nodded, her resolve unwavering. "We'll start by telling the truth. All of it." As the room fell silent, the weight of Eleanor's confession hung heavy in the air. It was a step toward closure, but Margaret knew the journey was far from over. The truth had come to light, but justice was still waiting. The morning after Eleanor's confession, the mansion was quieter than it had been in years. The usual hum of the staff moving about was muffled, as if even they could sense the gravity of what had transpired. Margaret sat at the breakfast table, the warmth of her tea doing little to calm the storm inside her. Across from her, Lila toyed with her toast, her expression distant. Neither had spoken much since Eleanor had left the night before. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Lila," she said gently, "how are you feeling?" Lila looked up, her eyes clouded with a mix of emotions. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me is relieved. We finally know the truth. But another part of me, I just can't believe someone could do that to their own family." Margaret reached across the table, taking Lila's hand in hers. "I can't either," she said softly. "But what's important now is that we make sure Eleanor faces the consequences of her actions. For Emily, for you." Lila nodded, her resolve returning. "What happens next?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Samuel is filing a formal report with the authorities. Between the financial records, the letters, and her confession, there's enough evidence to hold her accountable. She'll have to answer for what she's done." That afternoon, Samuel arrived with the final case files. The stack of documents he laid on the table felt like the culmination of years of pain and uncertainty. He flipped through them, explaining each piece with his usual meticulous detail. "This is more than enough to build a case," Samuel said, his tone firm. "The financial transactions alone are damning, but the letters from Emily add a personal dimension that can't be ignored. And now that we have Eleanor's verbal confession, It's only a matter of time. Margaret nodded, her eyes fixed on the stack of papers. And what about Lila? She asked. Will she need to testify? Most likely, Samuel admitted, but it will be straightforward. Her connection to Emily has already been proven through the DNA test. The courts will want to hear her side of the story, but she won't have to face Eleanor directly unless she's comfortable. Lila, who had been sitting quietly, straightened her posture. I'll do it, she said firmly. If it means getting justice for my mom, I'll do whatever it takes. Margaret's heart swelled with pride at Lila's courage. We'll be there with you every step of the way, she promised. As the legal proceedings began to take shape, Margaret prepared herself for the emotional toll it would take. Eleanor, predictably, fought back, hiring a team of high-powered attorneys to try and discredit the evidence. But the truth was on Margaret's side, and she was determined to see it through. The day of the first hearing arrived faster than Margaret had anticipated. She and Lila entered the courthouse together, their hands clasped tightly. The weight of the moment was palpable, but Margaret drew strength from Lila's unwavering determination. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor sat at the defendant's table, her expression stoic, but her eyes betraying the fear she tried to hide. As the evidence was presented piece by piece, the reality of her actions became undeniable. The letters from Emily, the financial records, the DNA test results, all of it painted a damning picture when it was Lila's turn to testify. Margaret watched with a mix of pride and sorrow as her granddaughter took the stand. Lila spoke with quiet strength, recounting her experiences at the orphanage, the absence of her mother, and the pain of growing up not knowing where she came from. My mom gave up everything to protect me, Lila said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. And now that I know the truth, I owe it to her to make sure the person who caused all of this is held accountable. Eleanor's defense team tried to poke holes in the testimony, but Lila's sincerity was unshakable. The courtroom fell silent as her words hung in the air, a poignant reminder of the human cost of Eleanor's actions. The trial stretched over several weeks, each day bringing new revelations and emotional confrontations. Margaret testified as well, recounting the pain of losing Emily and the devastating impact it had on her life. Through it all, she remained composed, her focus unwavering. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation as the judge read the decision. We find the defendant, Eleanor Collins, guilty on all charges, the judge declared. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Margaret exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She turned to Lila, who was gripping her hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. It's over, Lila whispered. We did it. Margaret nodded, her own tears threatening to spill. We did. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Lila worked to rebuild the pieces of their lives. The mansion, once a place filled with sorrow, began to feel like a home again. Lila spent more time at the piano, her music filling the halls with a sense of hope and renewal. Margaret, too, found solace in the simple moments, sharing meals with Lila, laughing at her stories, and rediscovering the joy of family. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Lila turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. What do we do now? She asked. Margaret smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. We honor Emily's memory, she said. We take the love she gave us and use it to build something beautiful. Lila nodded, her eyes shining with determination. For her, she said softly. For us. As the fire crackled and the night settled around them, Margaret felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in decades. The road ahead would still have its challenges, but for the first time, she felt ready to face them. With Lila by her side, together, they had uncovered the truth, faced the darkness, and emerged stronger. And together, they would write the next chapter of their lives, one filled with hope, healing, and the unbreakable bond of family. The weeks following the trial were a time of quiet reflection and tentative new beginnings. Margaret and Lila had emerged from the storm stronger, bound together not only by their shared grief, but by their determination to rebuild their lives in honor of Emily's memory. The mansion, once a place of hollow grandeur, was slowly transforming into a home. Lila's laughter, a sound Margaret had come to treasure, echoed through the halls. Margaret found herself spending less time in her study and more time with Lila, sharing stories, teaching her family recipes, and learning about the young woman Emily had so selflessly protected. One crisp morning, Margaret found Lila sitting at the grand piano in the living room, her fingers gliding over the keys as she played the melody that had first connected them. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching silently until Lila noticed her and smiled. "You've been practicing," Margaret said, walking over to sit beside her. Lila nodded. "It feels like a way to connect with her," she admitted. "I think about what it must have been like for you two, playing this together. It makes me feel close to her." Even though I never got the chance to meet her, Margaret's chest tightened, a mix of pride and sorrow filling her heart. "She would have loved you," she said softly. "She had such a big heart. She would have been so proud to see the woman you've become." Lila looked down at the keys, her voice quiet. "Do you think she ever doubted herself? I mean, leaving me at the orphanage. It must have been the hardest decision she ever made." Margaret reached over, gently placing a hand on Lila's. "I think it broke her heart," she said, "but she did it out of love. She wanted you to be safe, even if it meant she couldn't be with you. That's the kind of person she was, always putting others first." Lila nodded, her eyes glistening. "I want to be like her," she said. "I want to make her proud." "You already have," Margaret said, her voice firm. "You're brave, kind, and determined, just like she was. And now, we have the chance to carry her legacy forward." Together, later that day, Margaret and Lila began sorting through the box of Emily's belongings that Samuel had recovered from the abandoned property. Each item told a story: an old journal filled with sketches and lyrics, a scarf that still carried the faintest trace of Emily's favorite perfume, and a stack of photographs, some faded with time but still vivid with memories. Margaret picked up one photo in particular, her breath catching as she recognized it. It was of Emily as a teenager, standing in the garden behind the mansion, her smile wide and unguarded. Margaret handed it to Lila, who studied it with reverence. "She was beautiful," Lila said, running her fingers over the image. "I wish I could have known her." Margaret smiled wistfully. "You remind me of her," she said. "She had that same spark in her eyes, that same determination to make the world a better place." As they continued sorting, Lila came across a folded piece of paper tucked into one of the journals. She opened it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. "What is it?" Margaret asked, leaning closer. "It's a letter," Lila said. "From Emily to you." Margaret's breath hitched. "Let me see." Lila handed her the letter, and Margaret unfolded it with trembling hands. The words, written in Emily's familiar handwriting, were faded but legible. "Dear Mom, if you ever find this, it means I couldn't make it back to you. I'm so sorry for the pain I've caused, but I hope you can understand why I did what I did. I had to protect Lila. She's everything to me, and I couldn't let her grow up in fear. Please don't blame yourself for what happened. It wasn't your fault. You always gave me so much love, and I carried that with me, even when things were hardest. I hope Lila finds her way to you one day. You're the kind of person who can give her the life I always wanted for her. Thank you for being my mom. Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't deserve it. And thank you for being the kind of person I could look up to, even from a distance. I love you. Always. Emily." Margaret's tears fell freely as she finished reading, the weight of Emily's words pressing against her heart. Lila, sitting beside her, wiped at her own tears as she placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "She loved you so much," Lila said softly. "You were her anchor, even when she couldn't be here." Margaret nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'll carry that love with me every day," she said. "For her. For you." They sat in silence for a while, the letter resting on the table between them like a bridge connecting past and present. The pain of loss was still there, but it was tempered by the warmth of the bond they had forged. A bond born out of tragedy but strengthened by love. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Lila worked together to create something new out of the ashes of the past. Margaret transformed part of the mansion into a music room, filling it with instruments and photographs of Emily. It became a place of healing, where Lila could play the piano and explore her connection to her mother through music. One evening, as they sat in the music room, Lila turned to Margaret with a thoughtful expression. "I've been thinking," she said. "What if we used this space to help others? Maybe we could start a program for kids who need a place to feel safe, to express themselves." Margaret's heart swelled with pride. "I think that's a beautiful idea," she said. "Emily would have loved that." And so, together, they began planning a new chapter, one that honored Emily's memory and brought light to others. The mansion, once a symbol of loss, became a place of hope and renewal. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret and Lila found peace in their shared purpose. The pain of the past would never fully fade, but it no longer defined them. They had found each other, and with that, they had found the strength to move forward. The transformation of the mansion into a place of renewal progressed steadily, its halls filling with the energy of a new purpose. Margaret and Lila had decided to name their project Emily's Haven, a tribute to the woman who had inspired them to turn their pain into something meaningful. Word spread quickly about their initiative, and soon, families and children from the local community began arriving to participate in music lessons, art workshops, and storytelling sessions. The mansion, once shrouded in silence and sorrow, now buzzed with laughter and life. Margaret found herself reinvigorated by the joy of seeing the children thrive. Lila, too, had discovered a new side of herself, stepping into a role of leadership with natural ease. She often worked one-on-one with the children, sharing her own experiences and helping them find solace through creativity. One late afternoon, as the sun bathed the music room in golden light, Lila sat at the piano, teaching a shy boy named Danny how to play the melody that had become the unofficial anthem of Emily's Haven. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with pride as Lila encouraged the boy with gentle words. "You've got it," Lila said with a smile as Danny played a sequence of notes correctly. "See? I knew you could do it," Danny beamed, his confidence growing with each note. Margaret quietly stepped away, leaving them to their lesson, and made her way to the garden. The crisp autumn air carried the faint scent of leaves and flowers, and Margaret paused by the fountain where she had often found solace in the past. As she sat on the edge of the fountain, she reflected on how far they had come. The trial had been grueling, the revelations about Eleanor's betrayal devastating. But out of that darkness, something beautiful had emerged. Emily's Haven wasn't just a tribute to her daughter. It was a testament to resilience, love, and the power of starting over. That evening, after the last of the day's activities had ended and the mansion had quieted down, Margaret and Lila sat together in the living room, enjoying a rare moment of calm. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the warmth it radiated mirrored the sense of peace they both felt. "Do you ever think about what she would have thought of all this?" Lila asked, gesturing to the house around them. "Every day," Margaret admitted. Emily always wanted to make a difference. She had this way of seeing beauty in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. "I think she would have loved what we're doing here." Lila smiled, her expression thoughtful. "I hope so," she said. "I feel like I'm finally getting to know her through this place." "You are," Margaret said gently. "She's with us in everything we do, in every child who finds joy here, in every note of music that fills these halls. She's here." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the bond between them growing stronger with each shared moment. Lila broke the silence with a question that had been on her mind for some time. "Do you think Eleanor will ever change?" she asked hesitantly. Margaret's expression grew pensive. "I don't know," she admitted. "She has a long road ahead of her, and whether she chooses to take it is up to her. But what matters is that we've done our part. We've brought the truth to light. The rest is out of our hands." Lila nodded, her brow furrowing slightly. "Do you think she ever loved Emily, or me?" Margaret sighed, her heart aching at the question. "In her own way, I think she did," she said. "But Eleanor's love was twisted by jealousy and insecurity. She let those things consume her, and in the end she lost everything because of it." Lila looked down, her expression contemplative. "I hope she finds peace someday," she said softly. "Even after everything, I don't want to hate her." Margaret reached over and placed a comforting hand on Lila's. "That shows just how strong you are," she said, "and how much of your mother's spirit lives in you." The days turned into weeks, and Emily's Haven continued to flourish. Margaret and Lila received letters and calls from families whose lives had been touched by the programs they offered. A local newspaper ran a feature on the initiative, highlighting their journey and the inspiration behind the project. The story caught the attention of people beyond Boston, and donations began pouring in, allowing them to expand their efforts. One afternoon, Margaret received a package in the mail. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small velvet box. The letter was from Eleanor. "Margaret, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me for what I've done. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you'll allow me to say this. I'm sorry. For everything. For Emily. For Leila. For the pain I caused you. I've spent my days in solitude, thinking about the choices I made and the lives I destroyed. I can't undo what I've done, but I want you to know that I regret it with every fiber of my being." In the box, you'll find something that belonged to Emily. I kept it all these years, though I didn't deserve to. It's time it went back to where it belongs. With you and Lila. I hope it brings you some comfort, Eleanor. Margaret opened the box with trembling hands, revealing a delicate locket. Inside was a small photo of Emily as a child, smiling brightly, and a lock of her hair. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she held the locket, the weight of Eleanor's gesture pressing against her heart. Later that evening, Margaret showed the locket to Lila. Together, they added it to the growing collection of mementos in Emily's haven, a reminder not only of the pain they had endured, but of the love that had carried them through. As they stood in the music room, surrounded by the echoes of Emily's spirit, Margaret and Lila felt a sense of closure. They had found each other, found purpose, and found peace, and in the warmth of Emily's haven, they knew her legacy would live on. Winter descended upon Boston, blanketing the city in a serene hush as snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. Emily's haven remained a beacon of warmth amidst the chill, its grand halls glowing with life. Inside, laughter and music intertwined, weaving stories of healing and hope. Margaret and Lila had grown accustomed to the rhythm of this new life, their bond strengthening with every shared memory and every step forward. One particular evening, Margaret stood in the music room, gazing at the wall of photographs they had curated over the past months. It was a collage of moments that celebrated not just Emily's legacy, but the joy and resilience of the children whose lives had been touched by the haven. At the center of the display was Emily's locket. Encased in a shadow box beneath her childhood photo, Lila entered the room quietly, a cup of tea in her hands. "You've been standing here for a while," she said with a smile, offering Margaret the cup. Margaret accepted it gratefully. "I was just thinking about how much has changed," she said, her voice tinged with wonder. "And how far we've come," Lila nodded, standing beside her. "It feels like she's still here, doesn't it?" she said softly, her gaze fixed on the locket. "In every note we play, every laugh we hear, she is," Margaret said firmly. "Her love is in everything we've built, and it always will be." The following day, Margaret received an unexpected phone call. It was from a reporter who had read about Emily's haven and wanted to feature their story in a national publication. The opportunity was both exciting and daunting, but Margaret saw it as a chance to honor Emily's memory on a larger scale. The reporter, a woman named Claire Donovan, arrived later that week, her enthusiasm evident as she toured the mansion. She asked thoughtful questions about the inspiration behind Emily's haven, the challenges Margaret and Lila had faced, and the impact the project had on the community. "What's been the most rewarding part of this journey?" Claire asked as they sat in the living room. Her notepad resting on her lap, Margaret glanced at Lila, who was seated beside her, before answering. "Finding her," she said simply. "Not just Lila, but finding Emily and everything we've done here. I spent so many years mourning her loss, but through this, I've realized she never really left. She's a part of this place, a part of us." Lila smiled, her eyes shining. "And being here has helped me find myself," she added. "I've always felt like something was missing, but now I know who I am, and where I belong." Claire nodded, clearly moved by their words. "It's a beautiful story," she said. "One that I think will resonate with a lot of people." The article was published a month later, and the response was overwhelming. Letters and emails poured in from people who had been inspired by Margaret and Lila's journey. Some shared their own stories of loss and healing, while others offered donations and support for Emily's haven. The mansion became a hub of connection. a place where strangers felt like family. Among the messages was one that stood out, a handwritten letter from a woman named Helen Richardson. She introduced herself as a former employee of the New York property where Emily had stayed. The letter contained details about Emily's time there that only someone who had been present could know. Margaret read the letter aloud to Lila one evening as they sat by the fire. "She writes that Emily talked about us constantly," Margaret said, her voice trembling. She wanted so badly to come home but felt she couldn't. Lila listened intently, her expression somber. "Does she say anything about what happened after Emily left?" Margaret nodded. "She mentions that Emily planned to head west, hoping to start fresh somewhere far from Eleanor's influence. She said Emily seemed hopeful, despite everything." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Helen's words settling over them. Finally, Lila spoke. "Maybe one day we'll learn more," she said. "But for now, we have her letters, her memories, and we have each other." Margaret smiled, reaching over to squeeze Lila's hand. "And that's enough," she said. As spring approached, Emily's haven continued to thrive. Margaret and Lila organized a special event to celebrate its success. A concert featuring the children who had learned to play music through the Haven's programs. The mansion's grand hall was transformed into a performance space, its chandeliers casting a warm glow over the eager audience. The night of the concert was electric with anticipation. Families filled the room, their excited chatter blending with the soft tuning of instruments. Margaret stood at the back, watching as Lila guided the children through their final preparations. When the performance began, the air was filled with the sound of music, a medley of melodies, including the song that had connected Margaret and Lila in the first place. As the children played, Margaret felt tears well in her eyes. Not from sadness, but from a deep, abiding joy. Lila took the stage for the final piece, sitting at the piano and glancing toward Margaret before beginning. The familiar notes filled the hall, each one a tribute to Emily's enduring spirit. As Lila played, Margaret closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. In that moment, she felt Emily's presence more strongly than ever, as if her daughter were sitting beside her, smiling. After the concert, Margaret and Lila stood together in the music room, the echoes of applause still ringing in their ears. "She would have been proud of us," Lila said, her voice soft but certain. "She would have been proud of you," Margaret replied, her hand resting on Lila's shoulder. "You've taken her legacy and turned it into something extraordinary." Lila smiled, her gaze drifting to the wall of photographs. "We did it together," she said, "and we'll keep doing it. For her." As the night deepened, Margaret and Lila stood in quiet reflection, their hearts full. The journey that had begun with loss had brought them to a place of healing and hope. Emily's haven was more than a tribute. It was a promise to carry Emily's light forward, illuminating the lives of others, and strengthening the bond between a grandmother and granddaughter who had found each other against all odds. In the end, Margaret realized, love had triumphed, and that was the legacy Emily would have wanted most.